Today's video features a paid partnership with BetterHelp. Okay, so unless you're living under a rock, you've probably heard about the release of Taylor Swift's latest album, The Tortured Poets Department, which I have listened to a couple of songs of, and if you're here for my review, you probably don't want to hear it, particularly if you're a Swiftie, but thankfully, you're not going to get it today, because we're going to talk instead about the title, because that intrigued me. It took me right back to the moment when I realised from a very young age that creativity and madness is glorified. They are seemingly interconnected and we don't seem to separate them, to the point that people are afraid of losing their creativity if they are to treat their mental health. It's been a discussion from not just recently, although more recently thanks to modern medicine, but the concept of the creativity and its inherent relationship with madness and lunacy goes back thousands of years. But does creativity demand a little lunacy? Well, we're going to discuss the history of that and look at some of the tortured poets and artists throughout history that have made this revelation relationship between the two a psychological concept that has been studied for several thousands of years. Okay, so before we get into the bit of a dark discussion in today's video, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's paid partner, which is BetterHelp. I've been using BetterHelp since I started my PhD just over 3 years ago now, and I really needed that support at the beginning with so many things like imposter syndrome, anxiety, and just so many issues I have going back into academia later in life. And BetterHelp was there for me when I couldn't get access to any other therapy, and that's important because BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy accessible. So even when you get the confidence to finally go and ask for help and get a therapist, finding a good therapist can be really hard. You have to go out, test people now and then, try different organisations, but with BetterHelp it's all on one platform. It makes finding a therapist really easy. You don't have to search for hours through the internet or travel to get support. It's entirely online and remote, and you can be matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a few days after filling out a simple questionnaire. They match you based on your needs and what type of therapist that you would like. So it's just like dating. You sometimes meet a therapist and you don't really click with them, but it's easy to swap and find another therapist at no extra cost. So you can specialise in your therapist. So if you want help with eating disorders or depression, anxiety, I even had a therapist who just completed her doctorate when I signed up to have help with my anxieties around starting a doctorate. So whether you're suffering with depression, anxiety, or just going through a really difficult stage in life with grief or stress, therapy can give you the tools that you need to approach life in a different way. It's really easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description box below. It's betterhelp.com/Cinzia. Clicking that link helps support my channel, but also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. I thought it'd be appropriate to start by citing Thesis in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Quote, "The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman, the lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in the brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. Such tricks hath strong imagination." The notion that creativity and psychopathology are linked goes way back in antiquity. Socrates conceived the demon as a divine gift granted to a few individuals, such as the philosopher, the poet, or the priest, and that enabled them to communicate with the gods. Also in ancient Greece, Aristotle, or his pupil Theophrastus, asked, quote, "Why is it that all men who are outstanding in philosophy, poetry, or the arts are melancholic?" In this questioning, Aristotle listed some Homeric or Sophoclean or mythological heroes such as Ajax or Bellerophon, or historical figures such as Empedocles, Plato, and Socrates. Noel Brown wrote that in the 15th century, Neoplatonic philosopher Marsilio Ficino saw melancholy as, quote, "the corporal price, as it were, to be paid for the soul's heroic endeavour to traverse the rationally unabridgeable gulf separating finite and transient nature from infinite and eternal supernature." Though it wasn't until, ironically, the Romantics entered the scene that we began to romanticise understanding the relationship between madness and creative genius. I'm using the term madness here as a general, ancient, archaic term for the concept of mental health because that's kind of what we're discussing it here in artistic terms. But note that I don't do that to undermine the severity of mental health and the psychopathology of it. Now, when most of us are asked to think of a tortured artist, most of our minds tend to turn to Vincent van Gogh or Vincent van Gogh. I never really heard entirely how it should be pronounced. Van Gogh very famously was mentally unwell. He suffered from severe depression, mutilated one of his ears in 1888 and entered an asylum, and then shot himself in 1890 at the age of 37, whilst at the height of his creative output. His output of letters and pictures displays a strong internal cohesion, said 3 researchers at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam in 2010. This double oeuvre cannot be dismissed as a product of a sick mind. On the contrary, it can only be seen as the legacy of a truly great intellect, the real Van Gogh. By the 20th century, society had seen the tragic end and mental unravelling of some of the most profound and greatest artists of the time: Ernest Hemingway, Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, and Jackson Pollock, all of whom took their own lives. In 2001, psychologist James C. Kaufman conducted 2 studies analysing first the works of 1,629 writers and then 520 prominent women for signs of mental illness. In both groups, female poets were significantly more likely to suffer from mental illnesses than any other group. He dubbed this observation and his paper the Sylvia Plath effect. In 2012, a Swedish study found that writers in general were 121% more likely to suffer from bipolar disorder and 50% more likely to take their own lives. Similar scientific opinion can be found as far back as 1889, when Lombroso wrote an entire book about the connection between genius and madness. Lombroso reached several conclusions that later studies have also supported with more refined methodologies, and they established that creativity is genetically intertwined with the predisposition to affective and schizophrenic psychosis, psychopathy, and alcoholism. Many studies have been conducted about this overlap. There seems to be, for example, a strikingly high rate with mood disorders and suicide amongst the British and Irish poets between 1705 and 1805. A biographical study of letters, medical records, family histories, and biographical works of 36 poets, including William Blake, Robert Burns, Lord Byron, John Clare, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Cowper, Thomas Gray, John Keats, Walter Scott, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and William Wordsworth, found a very high rate of mental illness amongst the poets. Only 7 of the 36 did not demonstrate symptoms of a mood disorder, whilst more than half did. 2 took their own lives, and 6 were committed to asylums and madhouses. Of the group compared to the general population, the study concluded that the poets were 5 times more likely to take their own lives, 30 times more likely to have suffered a manic depressive illness, and 20 times more likely to have been committed to an asylum. The strong association between madness and creative genius leaves many artists to even today afraid to see themselves treated for their conditions. Early 20th century poet Rainer Maria Rilke said, quote, "If my demons leave me, I'm afraid my angels might take flight as well." When the artist Edward Munch, painter of The Scream, was recommended psychiatric treatment for his mental conditions, he responded, quote, "They are part of me and my art. They are indistinguishable from me and it would destroy my art. I want to keep those sufferings." John Green also spoke very openly more recently in a video expressing how he too once feared that going on medications for his anxiety and OCD would rob him of his creativity. American poet Robert Lowell, in conversation with Oliver Sacks, spoke of how taking lithium in the late 1960s saved him mentally, but he felt as though his poetry had lost, quote, "much of its force," a fear which very tragically was vindicated by his later poetry being less critically acclaimed than his pre-lithium ones. So here's the age-old question: does psychopathology cause creativity, or are people who are more creative more likely to suffer from mental illnesses? Well, obviously there's so many avenues to go down. First, we need to understand whether or not creativity is considered genetic. From what I could find when reading at the moment, creativity is largely considered an emergenetic trait. That is, a second-order trait that results from the synergistic interaction among a cluster of more fundamental characters, such as novelty-seeking and analogical thinking, capacity for extreme hard work, high confidence, love of mental activity, and the ego. I'm citing a lot from a paper that I'm just going to cite on the screen. I can't remember the author's name, but I'll link it down below as well. There was a recitation of a 1988 study by Richards, which found that first-degree relatives of manic depressive patients obtained the highest creativity scores when compared to normal control subjects, manic depressive patients, and cyclothymic patients, which is a milder form of bipolar. The difference was not explained by any effects of education or intelligence. And yet another study from 2000 to 2001 by Kinney et al. Studied adoptees of biological parents with schizophrenia and a group of demographically matched control adoptees with no family history of any psychiatric hospitalization. It found that the adoptees by genetic liability of schizophrenia who did not manifest the disorder in themselves were actually rated more creative by blind independent researchers. And adoptees who showed signs of personality traits of mimic schizophrenia were rated even more creative. Another paper by Post in 1996 hypothesized that the combination of a high level of emotional imagination and intense neural activity involved in writing and depressive personality traits may account for writers' increased risk of affective disorders. A very similar paper by Storr in 2000 pointed out that the act of writing can actually serve as a way of objectifying negative emotions and enabling a writer to build something out of them. This is very similar to Graham Greene, who wrote, quote, "Writing is a form of therapy. Sometimes I wonder how all those who do not write or compose or paint can manage to escape the madness, the melancholia, and the panic fear which is inherent in the human condition." Now, even I, as I was reading about this topic, became a bit disheartened by it. It would seem that creativity and mental despondency seem interconnected, almost inherent as it were. We have these famous artists who suffered for their art, though again we have to break this down. The correlation and causation are not always there. Whilst yes, there is an overlap, but to conclude that it's necessary for an artist to suffer, to be despondent and have melancholia as necessary for an artistic output, completely ignores the millions upon millions of artists throughout history and who exist today who do not suffer from extreme mental illnesses and yet who have successful creative and artistic outputs. We also have to consider the socioeconomic issues that may have impacted certain artists and their success. Many artists in the past chose an artistic career which was not profitable. We can't ignore the relationship between a lack of financial stability in the artistic world and that impact on the mental health. Many people in the past and today who take an artistic creative route are not billionaires such as Taylor Swift, and we can't overlook the possibility that actually their financial circumstances were the cause of their mental deterioration back then and today. Additionally, we can't overlook the debilitating nature of illnesses such as anxiety and depression, which are paralysing to people. They cause people to not read books, not invest in themselves, not look after themselves, and potentially suffer extreme illnesses or die early, and do not explore the world, become creative and inspired by the things around them. Mental health issues and suffering and grief can be such a source of inspiration, but they're not something to hold on to. They have something to feed the mind and learn from it. Introspection can be an incredible resource for artists and creatives around the world, but it does not define you. And if anything, allowing something to fester within us and allow it to maintain it and feed it is actually more toxic than it is creatively fueling. I've heard many people react to the Taylor Swift album and say that she's discovered that it is actually the process of heartbreak that inspires her, that is her muse, than rather the dating experiences themselves. And I hope that isn't the case. I don't want someone to find that they are addicted to a certain suffering as their muse. I don't want that to be the outcome and realization for someone such as Taylor Swift, because that's not who she is. Identifying with a form of suffering is how we get trapped in our cages of mental health and believe that we are identifying with our mental health condition, not the humanness of ourselves. Suffering and grief and depression and anxiety are all human experiences, but they do not control our creativity. They are not our muses. They allow us scope for introspection. They allow us scope for exploring empathy and exploring the recesses of our minds, but we have to come out of them and not drown within them, because that is how we stop creating. That is how the lives stop functioning in these creative artists, whether that's Kurt Cobain or Sylvia Plath. One is not defined by their greatness of creativity, by the tragic ending of their tale. Many artists lived fulfilling lives and created magnificent artwork, and we'll never know if they suffered or not, whether that's Shakespeare or Homer. And to reduce artists to their tragic circumstances, to reduce artists to their trauma and mental health would be belittling Toni Morrison's scope of wealth and richness, to belittle and shrink what Roxane Gay offers to this world, to shrink down what Sylvia Plath gave to us. This is just my personal thoughts on something that I'm completely not qualified to talk about. I am not a trained psychologist or a therapist or counsellor, but I can look at creativity and madness from my own perspective and wonder that I think the creative mind is more susceptible to dark thoughts because it creates them. If you have the ability to create things within yourself, you are able to fatalize your life. You're able to think of the darkest parts of nature. You are able to imagine the empathy of experiencing the horrors of the world and what it is to be human, and you can encapsulate yourself in that. I don't believe it is essential, though, for creativity. I believe you can reverse and learn from the dark thoughts and not have to feed them and water them and maintain them to maintain your creative spirit. And to suffer and to grieve and to be anxious is to be human, but not everyone who suffers with extreme mental health issues create anything worthwhile. And there are millions of people who have never suffered diagnosable mental health conditions who are incredible, famous artists today. I think there is a danger in glorifying the necessity of lunacy and madness with creative endeavours and art. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the romanticisation of tortured poets. I think it is just not a secondary byproduct. I think dark academia is a byproduct of the long-standing ancient tradition of the tortured artist and melancholia. But I believe the exploration of the human condition is something which is inherently an artistic product. I believe art and creativity is a byproduct or a product of someone expulging their experience of being innately human, the melancholia of the world and experience of suffering, grief, and all the inner workings of the mind. It cannot be transposed into anything but art. And that's why I feel like there are more artists who suffer from it than not. It is purely an expulsion of their inner thoughts out on paper. It's a therapeutic process, and I think it is one worth celebrating without romanticising. One does not need to believe they need to maintain their mental condition in order to create art. All life experiences, be they fleeting or permanent, are worthy of being transposed into art for both the audience and the artist's self-relief. I hope you found this discussion interesting. I really enjoyed looking into it. Please let me know your thoughts down below. Don't come for me for not being a Swiftie. My apologies. I'm indifferent. I suddenly have no taste. I think everyone can tell me that. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons. I thank you also to BetterHelp. And I'll see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.